to sort of take the morning forward with a panel that I think will be focused on some pragmatic implementation tools that hopefully many of you will find relevant. We have, as the previous panel made clear, plenty of information on the bio of our panelists, so I won't belabor the point. I'm delighted to be joined on stage with today by Caroline Escott from Railpen, a senior investment manager at Railpen, and Bev Shah, CEO of Hive. Both of them have developed frameworks which I think can be used to tease out some of the softer points that can happen in investment due diligence, particularly if you have that responsible lens. And so the panel question that we have that you'll see flashed up is really try to tease out, how often this group looks at culture to try to ascertain the investment opportunity. And we'll flash up the responses of the group at the end of the panel. So without further ado, I'd just like to get started on the two initiatives that we'll be discussing today. Caroline, maybe you can start and describe your initiative, its genesis, and where Railpen comes in.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And it's lovely to be speaking to you and to everyone today. We set up the Investor Coalition for Equal Votes, ICEV, around about 4 months ago. And it's a coalition of US and UK asset owners, got around $1.4 trillion in assets under management so far. It should hopefully be expanding to around 2 trillion very soon. And we set it up to try to push back against what we see as a growing issue of unequal voting rights, or dual class share structures. Dual class share structures, as I'm sure everyone in the room will know, has been around for a very long time, over a century. But we have seen recent moves by policymakers around the world to try to further enable dual class share structures in the search for growth. And we know we have had a torrid few years of it, and looks like it's going to be a pretty torrid few years going forward as well. So that is perfectly understandable. Of course, they are doing this at the same time as they are trying to encourage, quite rightly, investors to be more effective stewards of their assets and using all the tools that they have at their disposal. Now, the reason we don't like unequal voting rights is because for us, and I know again for many of you here, it strikes and runs counter to what is really a fundamental precept of capitalism, which is that your ownership of a company should be reflected one for one in the voting influence and the ownership rights that you have in that company. And with dual class share arrangements, what you have is a small group of insiders or a founder which has a certain economic stake in the company, but a disproportionate voting influence because of one share has around 10 or sometimes even 20 times as many voting rights as other shares do. Railpen came into this because we looked at what the big emerging issues were. We looked at sort of some of our priority holdings in our portfolio, and we looked at what investors are currently doing on dual class share structures. And there are organisations like the ICGN, CII. There are individual investors who've done an awful lot of stuff individually, in many cases, to try to fight back against dual class share structures. But we thought that there was space for something that was a little bit more coordinated, that really proactively involved a large mass of asset owner voices, and also thought about trying to pull some of the different available levers for influence. And we have two strands of work. So the first is focused on policymakers in priority jurisdictions, so the US and the UK to start with, to try to ensure that the regulatory framework is set up in a way that hinders as far as possible dual class share structures, or at the very least ensures that if companies are using dual class share structures, there are some very strict limitations in place. And we in ICEV are quite pragmatic. We understand that there are some short-term benefits for founders and company performance from dual class share structures, but those, the evidence shows, tend to dissipate in terms of that performance and innovation and so on after around 7 years. So for us, a mandatory time-based sunset clause of around 7 years or less feels about the right approach. The second phase of work is trying to get to companies before they IPO, and really at quite a significant period of time before they go to listing, to try to engage with them, to try to get them to understand that long-term investors are willing to work in partnership with them and are willing to be pragmatic, but we need that commitment, that very powerful signal of working in partnership with us in order for a company to be truly attractive. We're also sort of for this strand of work, working with pre-IPO advisors. We recognize that every company that is looking to list has a plethora of different advisors, legal, investment banking, communications, and so on. And in our initial conversations so far, we recognize that the perhaps the distaste of the institutional investor community for dual class share structures is not necessarily being communicated as effectively or as consistently as we would like to see. So we think equal voting rights are absolutely fundamental for asset owners or indeed asset managers to be able to influence on every other ESG issue out there, which is why we got involved, and Railpen chairs this initiative, but we work very closely with CIO, who are vice chair, and at the moment a core coalition of US pension funds, but we will be looking to work with other investors, other asset managers, other asset owners as well. This will be asset owner led over the coming, I say, months and years, and I think it might well be a multi-year coalition, just because of the nature of the different interests and the number of different types of financial market participants and different interests involved.
Thanks, Caroline, for that overview. Very clear. So we've just heard from Caroline about one particular initiative, coalition-led. We're now going to hear from Bev about her initiative, the ACT framework. Bev, can you give us the genesis of that framework and how you see it applicable, particularly for asset owner, maybe due diligence efforts?
Yeah, so Hive is a think tank and advocacy group that is on a mission to democratize access to investing and investments. Unfortunately, we won't be able to achieve all the lovely things that we heard about in the panel before if rooms don't look more like actually this room. Surprising to be in the city and actually to be in a room that's so diverse. Prior to setting up Hive, I was a fund manager researcher, is probably the best way to put it. I've worked on across the investment pipeline from private clients to being an asset owner. So really recognize that actually if you want the industry to change, and talking about asset managers in particular, you do need to hit the CEO and areas of the business with more than just this is the nice to have and this is the right thing to do. You know, again, Mark mentioned, you know, in his last comment about the FD coming in to see the CEO, and that's where we could really see with our work at Hive of how you can create real change in the industry. Culture is where it sits, you know, so ACT is a framework that enables those who are looking at asset managers to hold a mirror up. Instead of just looking at the investee companies you're investing through, look at the companies who are investing for you and say to them, what are you doing and how is your culture shaped? So ACT helps companies to, or asset managers in particular, to lay out the heart and soul of their organization. It isn't prescriptive because there is at this point in time no right or wrong answer, and asset managers and investment companies come in all shapes and sizes. You know, there can be huge disparities on, you know, numbers of people who work there, where they're located, even their company structure, and all of that impacts what their culture will be like. But the other area is actually their businesses at the end of the day, and they're in it to make money. So if you want them to change, you need to hit them in that area. So ACT enables clients, whether you're asset owners, whether you're investment consultants, whether you're someone who's in charge of a wealth platform, whether you're a retail customer, to make a decision on whether that company is being honest about its culture. So this is definitely not a tick box exercise. We're not asking, you know, what are your numbers on, for example, gender. We're asking you, what's your attitude towards data? And what we're doing is we're asking companies to compete against themselves. What are your stated values? And how do you live those values through your external behaviors, your internal policies and practices, and your investment practices? Because we hear lots from asset managers and their fund manager about what they're doing in their investment process, but we don't know actually what's happening beyond the product we're investing in. And they know this. And that's why we aren't seeing the progress we should be seeing within culture. And that's why we're seeing the very clever communications going out and the greenwashing that happens. And hopefully this will stop that. I mean, it's already been used, it's already been put into processes. Hargreaves Lansdown, for example, have gone out publicly to say that this is as part of their due diligence process.
So actually, you launched this relatively recently, Bev, if I'm not mistaken. How many asset managers are signing up voluntarily to follow the ACT framework?
So we launched in mid-May with a chuckle because I can't believe that over 50 firms globally have started to complete this, and this is our target was not even half of that for the year. You know, this was over the summer, so within 3 months, with some client push. You know, it wasn't. I'd love to say it was me sending out a mass mailer and people started to pick this up, but it was because this has teeth. It has clients behind it who are saying, and so ACT has a stewardship council that governs how it will develop, and that stewardship council is made up of investment consultants and other fund analysts who understand the asset management ecosystem but aren't necessarily experts in culture. This means it will go at the pace that is the right pace for the industry, enough push without, so it's attainable but also aspirational. So over 50 firms globally have started to complete it, and it enables them to control and look at the narrative of who they are as an organization in a qualitative way. You know, we aren't asking for data points. It's really, unfortunately, you know, we're so used to numbers. It's so easy to print out a spreadsheet and look at what's red, green, and orange today, as opposed to actually get in deep and look at what's being written and what does this organization actually mean. You know, I haven't, when I was an investor, I had no issue when I was investing, I don't know, for example, with a hedge fund, if they were all about greed and avarice, because that's what I expected. They didn't lie about it. They didn't say, you know, diversity is in our DNA. We're all about ESG. We want to save the world. And I'm all right with that because I know what I'm buying. It's the Ronseal moment. It's the other guys, the guys that claim all the other stuff that now you see adverts that, you know, on the television, diversity in your DNA, yet again by another firm. And yet when you go in and you just have to go along to an event, you just have to look at who's on their board. You just have to, and you know, none of this is true. There's a lot of greenwashing. You know, hosting an event on International Women's Day is not, or, you know, sponsoring Pride or all of those things are not the actual things we should be doing within our organizations. It's more about being honest about things.
So you're trying to get at that honesty through open-ended sort of questionnaires that you sort of collate back. And is there a feedback mechanism for the firms? I understand you're not trying to be prescriptive, but presumably, given the takeoff that you've had or the take up, you must have an idea what good looks like at this point.
I mean, good at this point in time is being honest. That's what good looks like at this point in time. It's actually doing the things that you're saying you're doing. I mean, I can imagine this is we're already looking at the disclosures that have been completed. It's actually quite exciting because compared to all other due diligence that we've seen in the past, and bearing in mind that, you know, I did this for 20 years prior to this, I've never seen companies actually come out with this. You know, we're being able to see how a company is actually being run and what they stand for compared to the other things they tell you, you know, or just looking at company accounts. And so for us at the moment, good looks like companies honestly disclosing what they're doing, what they stand for, and then for themselves to reflect back on themselves. You know, we're seeing some of these organizations going back internally and saying, do you know what, we're doing really well here, but actually we're doing nothing here. And often they don't even recognize that themselves. It's a way for them to actually, you know, go into the CEO and say, actually, this is where we need to do more. The other thing is as well, it's really difficult to compare companies if you just get the data points. You know, how can you compare a fidelity to a web, for example. You know, two completely different organizations, structured differently, globally different. You know, the resources are completely different, but this enables you to actually do that.
So you're trying to do like for like. So Caroline, we've just heard from Bev how she's trying to tease out some cultural attributes of investment organizations. Is there sort of some best-in-class attributes that you think of? Certainly, you mentioned the pre-IPO stage.
Yeah.
And I guess sector by sector could be quite different, how they view sort of issues of control and sort of founder-led innovation. Are there, you know, so being sector agnostic, if you will, are there some best-in-class attributes that your coalition is either already identifying or advocating for?
We are worried about dual class share structures because we think that, you know, they not only dampen the vote, but they also insulate management in a way that we find is actually unhelpful. So we do seem to find that dual class share structures are also linked to poor practice, which of poor practice on culture and poor practice on a culture of shareholder openness and shareholder friendliness. For us, when we are thinking about what an open culture might look like, there are a few things that, as you say, are sort of a sector agnostic, and I think mostly jurisdiction agnostic as well. So the first is access. Can we have a conversation with the people we need to have a conversation with? Are they open to at least acknowledging our concerns? You know, we at Railpen, for those of you who don't know, also the in-house asset manager for the UK Railways pension schemes, we have about £37 billion of assets under management, which makes us big in UK terms. So our access with UK companies tends to be quite good, makes us little in terms of the, or moderately sized, let's put it that way, in terms of the broader ecosystem and globally, when you look at investors and asset owners worldwide. So our access with US companies, we have to work a little bit harder than that. But if we have a really burning issue, we've taken the time to try to build relationships and to try to position ourselves effectively, are we able to access the people that we need to speak to on the issues that we want to talk to them about? And the second piece is referring back to what Bev was actually saying around transparency and honesty and reflection. It's great that there is so much more disclosure coming out from lots of different companies, but a lot of disclosure is still not being done particularly well. It's still not really telling the full story. If we are able to have a meeting with those companies that we're invested in, are they able to be transparent and to tell us a compelling story and to show us exactly what they're doing and the issues that we care about? And the other piece is, again, linking back to what Bev was saying around willingness to listen, so willingness to take our concerns on board. Are we seeing measurable progress over time on the issues that we've discussed or in some of the broader issues as well? So I think those are the things that we are really looking for in terms of a shareholder-friendly culture. Our experience and the experience of other investors that we speak to has shown that where you have dual class share structures, it sort of bakes in or really disincentivizes that kind of shareholder-friendly culture in a way that is very worrying for us.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned sort of the things you're looking for, the best-in-class attributes, if you will. Bev's initiative has a sort of feedback loop built in terms of how she goes back to the people who've answered her questionnaires. What kind of toolkit, if I can use that term, would you like to see for your initiatives in terms of improving the issuer-owner dialogue? I know of one that I'll just mention for the audience in case you haven't heard of it. It's a think tank that my company is a member of. It's a not-for-profit called FCLT Global. It stands for Focused Capital on the Long Term. And they've developed what I think are some pretty good sort of effectively talking points, so that if you are sitting across the table from each other and not hearing each other, you sort of try to get to yes, if you will. Is there something like that in the offering for your initiative?
So certainly for our coalition of coalition members, the current coalition members, and hopefully the many others who will be joining us in the future, we certainly do have a set of investor expectations and also some key messages, and as you say, sort of talking points to help try to guide the conversation in a way that ensures that everyone in the room on the Investor Coalition for Equal Vote side of the table is aligned, and also tries to respond to what we know were the questions that companies are coming up with and the kinds of things that they are saying when we approach them about this issue. In terms of the landscape more generally, and things that we would like to see, I think seeing that are working well, I think it probably depends on, as an asset owner, on the nature of your investment arrangements. So again, at Railpen, if you don't know how we invest, since 2013, we've been undertaking an investment transformation program where we have been internalizing more and more of our assets under management, because we found that that was a cost-effective thing to do, and we could still outperform and still do what we needed to do for our members. So we run the majority of our assets in-house. That is one of the reasons actually why Railpen can get these individual meetings with our key holdings as well. We work very closely with our internal fundamental sort of conviction-led portfolio managers on those engagements and those meetings and those discussions too. So I think for us, if it's sort of a wish list for a toolkit, and I'm not necessarily sure that the market has got to this just yet, in terms of supporting the dialogue, it's actually as simple as a really good engagement objective and progress tracking database. So we have voting platforms and some of these other organizations in the sector are trying to add on engagement databases, but they don't really do, they're not as intuitive as we need them to be. They don't really do what we want them to do. So we're thinking actually about building one ourselves to try to sort that out. If you are, and I know that we are not the only asset owner or even asset manager who is struggling with that kind of issue. So I think that kind of thing is really helpful in ensuring that you can measure the progress of your conversations. You can very clearly define what your red lines for escalation are and which tool in the stewardship toolkit you need to use next, if you're not making the progress that you want to. For those asset owners who have delegated to asset managers where a lot of their assets are sort of managed externally, I think that anything that helps the information flow, so maybe things like Bev's talk and so on, helps the information flow around between the asset managers and the asset owners, not just on the asset managers themselves, but also on the portfolio companies, to help the asset owners hold them to account is really positive. So to that end, I think things like the FCA's vote reporting group, for instance, which is looking at how you support better disclosure and more consistent disclosure of voting to asset owners, to support asset owners in dealing with their new regulatory requirements, as well as holding the asset managers to account. I think that kind of thing is really powerful. And then just the guidance that is being produced by industry bodies, people like the PLSA, or by government departments like DWP, or regulators like TPR, and we had Mark Hill standing earlier, and they've produced some great stuff recently, and I'm looking forward to the single code of practice coming out soon, because I think that's going to have some really interesting stuff on climate change and stewardship. All that kind of stuff to support asset owners to be truly demanding clients, I think will only improve the nature of the shareholder dialogue and the state of stewardship, or shareholder company dialogue and investor stewardship overall.
Okay, so more to come on toolkits. And of course, during questions, if any members of the audience have a good example they'd like to cite or something that could be relevant to some of Caroline's points, please do so. I know we're sort of trying to catch up with the timing of the event, so I'm going to turn to Bev maybe for some points on toolkits, but also sort of where you'd like ACT to go. You've had a great start. And I'm just thinking in terms of the framework you've built, particularly on the T of ACT, the transparency framework, is there something in your sort of line of sight, sort of an end game, if you will, where that could become a bit of a tool that it becomes generally adopted?
Yeah, so, I mean, we all love a toolkit. And maybe that's because actually if someone's got the expertise and they've taken the time to build something, you know, I'd love to say, it's great when the experts build something, right? And it makes your life easier at work, and you can just go and use them. However, I'm also mindful that there are lots of initiatives out there. There's lots of support, and if you don't have the internal resource, and also because this subject often tends to be handed to people as a side of the desk sort of task, there's only so much resource firms have, and you can really see where an organization takes their stewardship and responsibility seriously is where they've actually allocated capital internally in terms of manpower and woman power. And they can use all of these toolkits and then integrate them across their organization. And that means not just with your ESG and sustainability teams, but that means actually being able to go and knock on the doors across your organization, you know, the scarier doors, the distribution sales teams, and all the other areas that actually care more about the greed and avarice than they do about the planet. And that's the challenge. With ACT, we ran a long consultation period, and actually, surprisingly, COVID helped because people were, you know, in the beginning anyway, willing to have a Zoom call with you, and when you can do it in your pajamas, why not? And people are much more open about things, and it means that we had a lot of insights from multiple stakeholders throughout the investment pipeline. And what I mean by that is often great conversations like are going to happen today happen with the regulator and with asset owners and with investment consultants, but they stop there. You know, below the line after that, conversations aren't had. And at that point, there's only generally conversations are had around investment returns and whether you can deliver them or not. And actually, that's where a lot of capital flows very quickly because they aren't in segregated mandates. You know, funds and the structure of the products make a big difference on how easy it is to move capital. So ACT was always created to cover the entirety of the supply chain. And our aspirations are certainly that the ACT mark is something of a B Corp for the investment industry. You know, being able to show, you know, your end user, even as an asset owner, if you use ACT, for example, in your investment process, being able to show your members that with the ACT mark that you have done this for investment trust boards, for example, and we are in talks with various associations, you know, investment trust boards to be able to hold their management company to account because they've used this. And, you know, in creating this, we've also taken into account the global regulations. You know, we haven't done this in silo. So this is a way to do that. So our aspirations are that we will continue to hold companies to account and push the dial and nudge them towards more transparency, but also add to the teeth. Now, at the moment, the teeth are the market. Because those disclosures are via a platform called DOOR, which is a due diligence platform, are available to clients to look at. But as we go further down, what we want to be able to, and as we see the disclosures over the next few years, we'll be able to see what direction they're taking. And with the advice of our stewardship council, we're likely to, in a very GIP style thing, have a kind of second layer of some form of rating. But I'll caveat that with a but. I think ratings often, which have teams of people go in, can be skewed, and so therefore we would look at ways of doing this, which may be, because we're looking at company culture, it could more likely be an internal survey. You know, we all know when the investment consultants go in, everyone polishes their shoes and the kitchen's tidied up. You know, that's not the real culture of an organization. So what we want to see is behind the curtain, really.
Okay, so I heard GIPS, which I know there's some people here from the CFA Institute, so they'll probably perked up when they heard that in terms of a standard and verification. I'm keen to get a couple questions in before we close off. Let me just sort of maybe ask you in a few words, Caroline and Bev. So the end game for you, is it no dual class share structures in any jurisdictions ever, or is it something a little bit less than that?
So the ultimate goal several years from now, we're very conscious of that, is that companies, there are no companies in the world that list with dual class share structures without a mandatory time-based sunset clause of 7 years or less. However, we do have some interim goals along the way. So the first is that IPO advisors really do transmit in a very knowledgeable way that the strength, and I think the growing strength of investor feeling on this to the companies that they're advising. It's that companies, pre-IPO companies increasingly recognize that investors want this, want equal voting rights, but also that they recognize that this is an opportunity actually to make a very powerful statement of commitment to working in partnership and to attract the kinds of long-term investors that we know they want. And maybe there's some stuff as well, sort of in a few years from now, around some of the index providers, maybe, although many of them have already made headway, maybe tightening up some of their rules for inclusion in some of the very biggest indices.
Thank you, Caroline. And for you, Bev, the end goal is that the entire investment industry follows the Act framework by a certain date?
Yeah, why not? And it's not just for, you know, those who have pitched themselves as being on a mission to change the world. It's also those dirty hedge funds and, you know, all those others who are, this is about being honest and being able to actually show that we are who we say we are. So yeah, it's for all investment companies. That's why it's called the corporate culture standard for investment companies and not just asset managers. We started with the asset managers. Why not start with our low-hanging fruit? But we've had interest across from private equity to you know, across all the investment landscape.
Okay, so encouraging signs. So I know there might be time for at least one or two questions. The results of your poll question might also be available. I don't know if somebody can flash those up, but clearly today we heard a lot about some very pragmatic steps that are being taken, initiatives being launched to try to tease out some of this softer stuff that's always, in my experience, the hardest stuff to actually get your hands on, which is culture and what drives behavior inside an organization. So hopefully that was helpful for all of you. Are there any questions from the audience or comments right here in the front? And over here after that.
Thanks for the panel. The discussion is really insightful. I just have one question about the proxy voting, which is a very important toolkit for the asset owners or fund managers to engage with the underlying investee companies. There are a few proxy voting advisors, like there are a few key proxy voting advisors in the industry. And what's your view on that? How the asset managers or asset owners can put kind of effort to avoid that those proxy voting advisors to be too dominant in the issues, like in the voting. Thanks.
Carol, maybe
Yeah,
you
yeah,
on
I
proxy
can go
voting?
So proxy voters are, yes, a really hugely important part of the stewardship chain. They're actually one of the sets of financial market participants that we at the coalition are talking to and will be talking to, but in fact, both the major proxy advisors have been taking very, very positive steps in the right direction on dual class share structures. I think that you know, there will always be a need, going back to some of the capacity issues that were being mentioned in the previous panel, there will always be a need for asset managers and asset owners to rely on advice. But, you know, thousands and thousands of holdings that we all have, it is impossible unless you have gigantic teams to really focus on all the holdings. We all need to prioritize, so we need that third-party research from elsewhere. But, you know, I think that the proxy advisors, we've got these best practice principles. I think they're doing a really good job. I think they are all upskilling and investing in, for instance, their analysis of ESG issues and the skills and their resources that they need in order to be able to give sensible views on that. So I think the proxy advisor community is moving in a very sensible direction. It's not perfect. We try to engage with our main proxy advisors at every available opportunity on the particular issues where we would like to see further analysis being undertaken and then incorporated into standard advice. But they are an important part of the chain. I think they're moving in the right direction. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I think we have one more question in the front here, sir.
Hi there. A question for Bev. I know it's early days, but perhaps one of the sympathies I may have for the asset management community in London is that it's such a competitive industry in under a lot of pressure, and therefore questions of diversity, cognitive and otherwise, are challenging to get in place when the pressures are so short term. Just wondering whether any of the analysis or data or trends that you see from asset managers shows any different trends within their subsidiaries abroad, whether the global asset management industry actually exhibits different behaviors or traits that perhaps London can learn from or perhaps needs to avoid?
That's a really good question. And we certainly do see themes come out from different regions, and often the push will come from that competition, really. It's you know, client-led or media-led as well, what's of interest and what's not. And if you just take diversity as the theme, that's very important in the UK and is growing in other regions. It's also a big question that's asked in North America, but the nuances are very different. So it's really difficult for organizations which are global in nature, which are governed by different legal systems. You know, in the States, for example, where your headquarter is and what federal jurisdiction you're in will govern whether you can even ask for data. And those things aren't always known by the people who are collecting the data, which is a lot of pressure for organizations. So I think the industry would be a lot better focusing on the culture element than the actual underlying how, you know, what are your diversity data questions? Because actually, we are businesses at the end of the day. You know, yes, it's a competitive market, and yes, we want to be sustainable businesses and create a sustainable world. But the reason why we haven't seen as much movement within the diversity space, other than a lot of, what is the word? Is it greenwashing, brownwashing? I don't know what the term is, but you're seeing a lot of that because it's an easier thing to do. But actually, if you ask the question around how much resource firms are giving, they aren't giving a lot. So I think London in itself, as a hub of the kind of the asset management world, has always led on a lot of this stuff. And I think that's why London is leading on setting a higher standard for culture within the industry. And that's partly because it's so centralized in one location. It's not because other areas and other regions don't care. So hopefully that answers your question. I think I've got, but hopefully it does. There's, you know, there is pressure, but if you kind of, and people haven't, I don't think in the theme, haven't quite linked it. This does sit within the S of ESG. This does sit in whether, how do we solve all of these problems around climate and other things that we're trying to resolve? If we don't have people from different backgrounds, I mean, it's as simple as that. You're not going to get more robust decision making. And that's what it comes down to. Better outperformance, better companies, better investment returns.
Thank you, Bev. And on that note, I think I'll bring this panel to a close. I'm going to hand it back to Adrian Lawler, who's going to be in conversation with two people from our host today, Alan and Overy. But if I could just ask the audience to please thank our panelists today.
Thank you.